Good evening, and thank you for joining us today. Welcome to the Eisenhower Presidential Library. My name is Joy Murphy. I'm the Director of Learning and Engagement. This is our Evenings at Ease program. And today we are pleased to welcome Mr. Scott Finney, who is going to talk to us about the Suez Canal crisis. So take it away, Mr. Finney.
Thank you so much, Joy. So the first slide is the title of my presentation, Saying No to a Close Friend, President Eisenhower's decision not to support British military intervention during the Suez Crisis of 1956. And this here is a photo of Eisenhower and British Prime Minister Anthony Eden shaking hands. Ready for the next slide. Thank you. So some of the key personalities of the Suez Crisis are seen in the images here. We've got President Eisenhower on the left. In the middle, we have the Canadian External Affairs Minister and eventual Canadian Prime Minister from 1963 to 1968, Lester B. Pearson. And we'll talk about the Canadian-American collaboration throughout the Suez Crisis as well. And then on the right, we see Lester B. Pearson and former British Prime Minister Anthony Eden. Ready for the next slide. Thank you. So I am a PhD candidate through Manchester Metropolitan University. And the title of my PhD thesis is Friends Through Thick and Thin, Canadian Personal Diplomacy with Britain and the United States During the Suez Crisis. So I'm completing my PhD online via distance, and my thesis supervisor is the outstanding historian, Dr. Graham Cross, who's been an incredible support for me, and he is a great historian who always gets me to develop a more in-depth understanding for the historical method the more and more I work and collaborate with him. So thank you, Dr. Cross, for all your amazing work. It's an honor and a privilege to work with you. Other than that, I have an image up above of a series of newspaper headlines that broke out during the Suez Crisis in '56. The image is courtesy of the BBC News. I'm all ready for the next slide. Thank you. So to start, I've got a big thank you to give to a few people and to a few institutions besides my thesis supervisor. For starters, my amazing wife, Jana Hickling, thank you for everything. My parents, mom and dad, thanks for everything. My brother, my Aunt Jane, who's tuning in watching, thank you, Aunt Jane. Of course, Dr. Cross, as I mentioned. And the outstanding staff at the Dwight Eisenhower Presidential Library and Museum. A big thank you to Joy. It was an honor and a privilege to meet you last week when I was at the museum doing research. Thank you for all your hard work, Joy. Samantha, thank you for all your hard work and collaboration as well. And to several other staff members at the Eisenhower Museum and Library, thank you for your kindness and your assistance. In addition to that, I also want to give a big thank you to some of my professors that taught me at Mount Royal University. Tom Brown, Scott Murray, Dave Clemis, Corey Street, Jennifer Pettit at UBC, Dr. Allison Taylor, and Rob Van Winsberghe. Also Wade Lorenzen at Mount Royal. Thank you, Professor Wade, for taking me to Mexico to do work on an orphanage for 4 years and giving me a leadership role. On top of that, thank you to some of the MMU staff who are helping me, Dr. David Day and Dr. Marie Malloy. Other than that, just a thanks to a few of my colleagues at Third Academy. Sue Choi, thank you for tuning in, Sue. Sunil and Rahana Matu, Christos Kazias, thanks for being a social studies advocate and enjoying the subject as much as I do and all the great conversations. Peter Liu, thank you for everything. James Knapp, Joe Smith, Bruce Freeman, thanks for all our great conversations over the years, and Tracy Galuli. Other than that, I'm done with my thank you. Sorry if I took a little long there with my thank you list. So now we're ready to get started. So there's a methodological lens throughout my doctoral thesis that's guiding me in my analysis of personal diplomacy and the actions of President Eisenhower and the British and Canadian governments and diplomats. And it's driven by a book written by Srdjan Vucetic, and it's called The Anglosphere. According to Professor Vucetic, there's a coalition of English-speaking countries that have worked together very closely as allies to help spread and fight for the idea of liberal democracy. And he states that the 5 main Anglosphere countries are the United Kingdom and the United States, Canada, New Zealand, and Australia. But in addition to that, Professor Vucetic puts an emphasis on the fact that habits of cooperation have been able to sustain friendly relations among Anglosphere countries. And even though he talks in his book, The Anglosphere, about the fact that the greatest Anglo-American crisis of the 20th century was Suez, he puts an emphasis on the fact that the habits of cooperation in the Anglosphere were able to sustain strong relations, particularly Anglo-American relations, in the aftermath of the crisis. And he draws attention to Eisenhower's statement that the Suez Crisis was a family spat. And Vucetic's idea of the Anglosphere is not something new. Others have put an emphasis on it before. Former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill wrote multiple books on the history of the English-speaking peoples. So this is an idea that is an important methodological lens to help us understand the difficult decision that Eisenhower made and how habits of cooperation sustained Anglosphere relations throughout the crisis. And I'm ready for the next slide. Thank you. So Eisenhower's decision-making approach towards the crisis. So this presentation will argue that the late historian and former Eisenhower biographer Stephen Ambrose was mostly correct in stating that Eisenhower employed the following process in dealing with the Suez Crisis. And I quote, "The proper response was to remain cool, gather all the information he could, consider the options, and use them to take control of events." Now, I argue that that is mostly correct. As an addendum, what I would say is that it wasn't necessarily always about taking control of events, although that was part of what Eisenhower was trying to do. But Eisenhower was trying to do what he talked about in the second volume of his presidential memoirs. He was striving to wage peace through making sure that all diplomatic options had been exhausted before resorting to force. And in addition to that, he also had confidence in the United Nations as an international body for conflict resolution. And he wanted to use personal diplomacy, multiple personal diplomatic channels, and every diplomatic option available. But he also wanted to use the United Nations in order to resolve the Suez Crisis. I think it's important to kind of touch a little bit on the history of Eisenhower's life at this point. Keep in mind that, he was the Supreme Allied Commander from 1943 to 1945. He had graduated from the United States Military Academy in 1915, and he had a career in the military. One of the quotes that came from Eisenhower and his reports when he visited the death camps after they were liberated in World War II is actually on the front of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. And all of that kind of comes together in Suez in a quote that is actually on very clear and visible display at the Eisenhower Museum. And that quote is, and I quote, "I hate war as only a soldier who lived it can." So he'd been through so much when it came to military conflict, and he knew if there was any chance to wage peace, he needed to take advantage. So Stephen Ambrose was mostly correct in that statement, but I would add to it that it wasn't necessarily just about taking control. It was about waging peace through using diplomacy and personal diplomacy in the United Nations to work through Suez. And on that note, I'm ready for the next slide. Thank you so much. So, some key facts and U.S. foreign policy towards the Middle East after World War II. So, Eisenhower wrote about the fact that by 1955, the Suez Canal was of immense commercial significance for the modern global economy, and that more than 100 million tons of goods and services moved through the canal. The top two countries that shipped goods through the Suez Canal were first the United Kingdom and second the United States out of 40 nation states. The significance of the Suez Canal as a medium for the flow of global commercial traffic is still immense to this day. In 2021, a huge container tanker ship got jammed in the canal, and in the process, the international press reports were flooding with descriptions of how significant the canal is for modern economic globalization and how much commercial traffic flow was being blocked every day that a giant container ship was jammed. And that was in 2021. So it was in 1956, and it's a very similar argument in 2021. So in the context of 1956, it was immensely significant from a commercial standpoint. So there were a lot of countries around the world, particularly the United States and the United Kingdom, that were watching the situation, the political situation internally within Egypt very keenly, with concern about the well-being of political stability and good relations with the Egyptian government. On that note, I'm perfect. Ready for the next slide. Thank you. So, Egyptian President Nasser seeks Soviet military support. So now we're kind of starting to touch on something that's immensely contextually significant in relation to what's going on here. We have the Cold War happening. The Cold War, most would agree, started even towards the end of World War II, but certainly many would state right after World War II. And with this ideological clash led by the United States and a series of capitalist democracies, there was a competition and a push to compete with and contain communism after the announcement of the Truman Doctrine of 1947 by former US President Harry Truman. And the Soviets, of course, they were striving to contain democracy and capitalism through what Winston Churchill described as their Iron Curtain of influence that had descended upon Eastern Europe. Well, with that, various nation states were looking for support, for various forms of support, and were making decisions about which countries to align with during the Cold War. And while Egypt was part of the non-alignment movement, which was joined by former Yugoslavia and India as well, Nasser was very, very interested in acquiring as much military firepower as he could due to a lot of the conflict going on in the Middle East, particularly the conflict at the time between Egypt and Israel. So Eisenhower feared a military deal with the Soviets was more likely, and so he sent an experienced diplomat, George V. Allen, to try and work out a deal with the United States. After George Allen's diplomatic mission was unsuccessful, in October of 1955, Egyptian President Nasser signed a military arms deal with Czechoslovakia. And basically, it was kind of done where Czechoslovakia was the satellite state of the Soviet Union, and through Czechoslovakia, the Soviet Union was providing arms to Nasser. Now, at this particular point in time, the United States and British interest and the interest of NATO allies, as NATO had been established in 1949, grew quite significantly in relation to Egypt and what was going on in the Middle East. Ready for the next slide. Thank you. So the Aswan Dam funding and cancellation incident was a major incident that was triggered by Nasser's actions. The initial commitment from the United States government to fund the dam came in December of 1955, but this changed with Egypt seeking military supplies from the Soviet Union through Czechoslovakia. And by July 19th, 1956, the United States and the United Kingdom, which had initially entered into an agreement with the World Bank, had withdrawn its support for funding of the Aswan Dam project. Now, basically what I've done here is I've put up a diagram just to kind of give you an idea for the compositional components of the Aswan Dam. It was something that was immensely significant to be developed and usable. And so you can see the features in the geographic landscape and the geological characteristics. And it's something that Egypt really wanted to get going to contribute to a rise in economic development. Egypt at the time was an economically disadvantaged country. Poverty was very rampant. So there was a desire to develop Egypt economically and raise the living standards, the quality of life and standard of living of the people of Egypt. And one of the ways that was seen as a possibility for doing that was the development of this type of infrastructure, particularly the Aswan Dam funding project. So when the United States and the United Kingdom had announced this cancellation, the events that triggered that were Nasser attaining military support from the Soviet Union via Czechoslovakia. I'm ready for the next slide. Thank you. So here I have President Eisenhower's description of the lead up to the crisis. In volume 2 of his memoirs, Waging Peace, The White House Years, a personal account, Eisenhower stated the following prior to the outbreak of this crisis. And I quote, "Under normal circumstances, we were quite content for the experienced British to take the Western initiative in promoting stability in the Middle East. But when the Soviet Union threatened to become actively involved, the United States could no longer remain a silent partner. We had to step in to counter the weight of Soviet power." So what we're seeing here now is the best tools for thinking about this are Cold War terminology. I want to draw attention to two key words and concepts in particular. Brinkmanship and détente. So brinkmanship is a Cold War policy in which you escalate a situation and you move things closer to the brink of conflict. Détente is when you diminish tensions through diplomacy, through deals, through more contact, among many other policy approaches. But the decision to cancel the Aswan Dam funding project was a moment of brinkmanship. And from that standpoint, there was definitely habits of cooperation for the Anglo-American alliance, for the United States and the United Kingdom. They were lock in step on the fact that they felt that the cancellation of this project was something that could be done, without any type of military action, but it was also something that would raise tensions. So you start to see this tit for tat Cold War brinkmanship breaking out in relation to what's going on in Egypt, and the temperature is rising, metaphorically speaking. I'm ready for the next slide. Thank you. The crisis begins. So from my standpoint, and from the standpoint of other historians as well, July 26, 1956 is seen as the day that former Egyptian president Gamal Nasser nationalizes the canal and the genesis of the Suez Crisis. And that's the premise that I'm operating from. And I put up this image just to show that now there will be, a rise in tensions, an arms buildup, and an escalation that will eventually lead to armed conflict. Next slide, please, and thank you. Okay, so initial negotiations to resolve the crisis. We can see here in the slide a picture of Eisenhower's former Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles. And from August 16th to 23rd, 1956, a conference is held in London, England, with a focus on negotiating a resolution to the crisis. Eisenhower sent his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, to London, and he proposed an idea for the canal to be run by an international board. 18 of the countries that attended would support what became known as the Dulles Plan. Okay, so I'm ready for the next slide. Thank you. So by September, President Eisenhower draws a line in the sand. On September 11th, 1956, Eisenhower gave a statement in which he made it clear that the United States would not support military action in the Suez Crisis. Now, this is a key moment. This is the moment where Eisenhower knows the temperature has been turned up. They've canceled the Aswan Dam funding project. President Nasser has sought military support from the Soviet Union through Czechoslovakia. Also in May of 1956, Egyptian President Nasser went on a trip to China and formally recognized the People's Republic of China. So the temperature is rising. Eisenhower sees the temperature is rising, but he realizes that it's not worth it to let the temperature rise any further. And now it's time to achieve some type of an apex, or let's flatline the temperature. Let's not let the temperature go up any further here. We've taken brinkmanship as far as it needs to go. Now the focus needs to be on employing and exhausting more diplomatic options moving forward. Next slide, please. So in this slide, we can see that the British, the French, and the Israelis don't quite agree as the weeks progress. So between October 22nd and October 24th, the British, French, and Israelis met in a suburb of Paris, France called Sèvres to plan out the details of their joint military operation against Egypt. And we can see officials of all three governments meeting, and in the middle we have Israeli Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion. So in this situation, what we see is the British, the French, and the Israelis meeting without the Americans, without consulting the Americans, and without letting Eisenhower know what they were doing, and deciding, let's go forth with a military operation. And they felt confident that they could do it without informing the Americans or without informing Eisenhower or consulting with the Eisenhower administration. Now, right around this time, the Eisenhower administration is tracking communications and diplomatic activity. And what Eisenhower and many senior officials in his administration are noticing is that suddenly there's radio silence from Whitehall, from London, from the British government. Suddenly there's not very much communication going on. And Eisenhower is feeling more and more suspicious, and they're noticing that British and French communication and diplomatic correspondence is increasing. There's a major traffic flow in relation to communication between these countries. So Eisenhower and his administration are starting to become increasingly concerned about what's happening, and they're starting to watch more and more closely. Ready for the next slide, please. Thank you. So the Suez Crisis goes to the United Nations. On November 7th, the United Nations General Assembly accepts the Canadian proposal for a United Nations emergency force to be added to the ceasefire to supervise and maintain peace. Now, I will go back a little bit. British troops also withdraw from Suez by December 22nd. But basically, it's Halloween in 1956, and October 31st, Halloween 1956, the British and the French do go forth with military action and airstrikes with a focus on dismantling the Egyptian Air Force. And that happened on Halloween, October 31st, 1956. So as Eisenhower and John Foster Dulles and many of his officials suspected, they went forth with a military operation. Very quickly after this, Eisenhower holds a press conference in which he makes one of the most famous statements of the Suez Crisis, and states that the United States was not consulted in relation to the military action and the airstrikes being led by the British and the French. And 2 days earlier, on October 29th, the Israelis had also entered into Egyptian territory, and they had started to engage in military action. So when President Eisenhower realizes all this, then the push is made to move forward with resolution through the United Nations. And from here, he relies a lot on his Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, as long as he can. Unfortunately, John Foster Dulles does end up hospitalized in early November, so someone fills in for Dulles. But Dulles does spend as much time as he can at the United Nations. And this is where we start to take a look at Canada and how Canada kind of played a role in bridging the gap between both the United Kingdom and the United States. And Eisenhower praised Canada for its efforts. So for this slide, it says that American pressure and Canadian diplomacy achieve resolution. Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister and Eisenhower's Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, worked closely together through the United Nations to establish a ceasefire and the United Nations Emergency Force, or the UNEF. And this would be the first time it would be deployed in the history of the United Nations. Canada's only Nobel Peace Prize was given to Lester B. Pearson in the fall of 1957 for his pivotal role in establishing a peacekeeping force to contribute to a resolution of Suez. Eisenhower gave high praise to Pearson for his actions during the crisis. But during the crisis, Eisenhower also made some difficult decisions. The theme of this year and an examination of Eisenhower's administration in his time as president. So Eisenhower, as Stephen Ambrose talks about in the same book and in the same chapter in which I support his main argument about Eisenhower's diplomatic crisis leadership resolution process, Stephen Ambrose also states that Eisenhower made another difficult decision, not just to refuse to support the British and the French militarily, but also Eisenhower had made the decision to withhold economic and resource-based support for the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom had gone to the International Monetary Fund for emergency loans. The Eisenhower administration had ensured that the International Monetary Fund would not give those loans until the ceasefire was agreed upon. On top of that, there was a request from the British to send barrels of oil to the United Kingdom because in the short time frame that military action had been engaged, Egyptian President Nasser had sunk some ships in the canal. So the flow of barrels of oil, and there were hundreds of thousands a day flowing through the canal to the United Kingdom, that was all cut off. So Eisenhower said that he would withhold any type of support until the United Kingdom had agreed to a ceasefire and a commitment to achieving peaceful resolution and respect for a United Nations emergency force. So that was a very difficult and tough decision for Eisenhower. And for the United Kingdom, they also had deeper financial problems. The quantity of capital in the reserve funds was lower. The United Kingdom was relying on the United States through Marshall Aid after World War II to help rebuild the country in the aftermath of the war and to help redevelop their economy and get things moving again. In addition, the Canadian government had given multi-billion-dollar loans to the United Kingdom after World War II to help them rebuild. So the United Kingdom was not in a financial position to have a sustained and prolonged war. And as Eisenhower stated in his memoirs, they'd spent roughly $500 million in just a few days of military action in relation to the Suez Crisis. So they got into financial trouble very quickly, but Eisenhower made the difficult decision to wage peace and to exhaust diplomatic options by withholding economic and financial and resource-based support to the United Kingdom until the United Kingdom made its commitment to a ceasefire, to a withdrawal, to respect for the United Nations emergency force. And with that, I'm ready for the next slide, please and thank you. So we can see in the next slide, the process of repairing damaged Anglo-American relations. As it states, in the aftermath of the crisis, Winston Churchill and Dwight Eisenhower exchanged letters. Churchill asked for American clemency on this issue in order to sustain Anglo-American relations. Churchill also talked about the fact that it would be important to just leave this situation to historians and move forward and reunite in focusing on diminishing the appeal, the influence of the common enemy of the United States and the United Kingdom, which was the Soviet Union. So in other words, let's get back to focusing on containing communism. You know, what's happened has happened. What's done is done. And, you know, as Vucic emphasizes in the Anglosphere, let's focus on habits of cooperation and rebuild these damaged Anglo-American relations and do so quickly. And Eisenhower concurs with Churchill on this course of action. And as I stated earlier on in the presentation, Eisenhower classifies this as a family spat. Another note on Canadian personal diplomacy, there was some resentment between British and American government officials. And there were moments in which Canadian diplomats were kind of going back and forth between agreeing with the Americans that the British made the wrong decision, but also bridging that gap and going and negotiating with the Americans going and negotiating with the British on behalf of the Americans to kind of smooth things off. And in Anthony Eden's memoirs, Full Circle, he wrote 3 volumes in his memoirs, the one Full Circle, Eden talked about the fact that he felt that, you know, Canadian diplomats and the Canadian government, you know, took a less harsh approach towards working through the crisis. And that's something that Eisenhower greatly appreciated. You know, if you read what was stated in Waging Peace, Eisenhower talked about the fact that Canadian Nobel Peace Prize winner Lester B. Pearson had helped turn the tide with his proposal for a United Nations Emergency Fund. But on top of that, he also praised Canadian Prime Minister Louis Saint Laurent for his willingness to work with the United States and for their assistance in helping to achieve an expedient resolution to the crisis. And this, once again, ties in with this idea of an Anglosphere and habits of cooperation between English-speaking countries. So while Anglo-American relations were strained and were suffering, Canadian-American relations were strengthened. And Eisenhower was very gracious in the way that he praised Canada. And in return, Eisenhower's difficult decision that he had to make led to him being praised internationally and America being praised internationally for its outstanding job in dealing with this. So yeah, it's fascinating to think about what Ambrose had talked about, and like I said, he mostly gets it right. There's just also needs to be an emphasis on the fact that, you know, Eisenhower had great respect for the United Nations, and he did not want to undermine the United Nations. He wanted to exhaust all diplomatic options possible, and he also recognized, you know, the threat of the Soviet Union was real. If the Soviets got involved in a conflict in Egypt, and Anglosphere countries also had a military presence on the ground, it could lead to all-out war. And at one point in the crisis, this is talked about on several sources. You can see right behind me here the book Suez by the late Keith Kyle, and also Ambrose's biography on Eisenhower. Khrushchev had also made a threat, a nuclear threat against Paris and London. So much going on, and the need to diminish tensions and wage peace, as Eisenhower titled his diplomacy, was really, really important in the context of this situation. And on that note, I'm ready for the next slide. Please and thank you. Okay, so it says on this one, a United States election in the midst of the crisis. 1956 was a presidential election year. Eisenhower was reelected on November the 6th. In relation to the election impacting his judgment on Suez, Eisenhower stated that, and I quote, "I will not under any circumstances permit the fact of the forthcoming elections to influence my judgment." Now, he also, on the same day of the election, had a phone call with former British Prime Minister Anthony Eden, in which he very bluntly stated that he, quote unquote, didn't give a damn about the election. But on top of that, I think it's important to recognize the controversy around all of this. Some feel a little uncertain about whether or not he just didn't care at all. There seemed to be a lot of confidence about the fact that he was likely going to be reelected. And while this criteria didn't exist in 1956, a good analysis on this actually comes from presidential historian and political scientist Alan Lichtman, who's written the book The Keys to the White House. And he looks at 13 true and false statements to help you understand the probability of a president securing 270 seats in the Electoral College, which is what's needed to become president, and winning the popular vote. And Lichtman, ever since 1984, has publicly been predicting the outcome of each presidential election since 84. But in the 2012 version of his book, The Keys to the White House, he uses the 13 true and false statements to analyze and interpret what was going on in the context of 1956. So I definitely recommend, if you get the chance, reading his analysis. And the reason why it's significant is because it turned out to be true. I mean, yes, in retrospect, but there did seem to be a pretty good indication that Eisenhower was likely to get reelected. Now, part of the controversy with all this also comes from what Stephen Ambrose stated on page 369 of his book, which you can see over my shoulder here, right there, Eisenhower the President. And that's the Stephen Ambrose biography I've been doing a lot of reading on. And it basically says that on page 369, in the excitement of the contest, Eisenhower shed his supposed indifference to the outcome. And then he talked about the fact that, he really wanted to win, and he was a winner, and he was looking to win. But I think it's also important to further nuance this, because the timing of his indifference, when he realized by November 6th that the United Kingdom had committed to a ceasefire, that the United Nations Emergency Force resolution had passed, Eisenhower saw that the tide had likely been turned, and this situation was likely already being diffused by diplomacy. So because he was confident that there was likely going to be diplomatic resolution moving forward, and the momentum had been generated to wage peace, then he shed his indifference and focused on the elections. So it's a really interesting and kind of gray area topic for discussion. Was Eisenhower totally indifferent? I think it's important to recognize that Eisenhower had accomplished so much, right? He was Supreme Allied Commander during World War II. He led the D-Day invasion. He'd already become president, and quite a successful president in his first term already. He was world-renowned. So for him, I think he realized that even if I don't get reelected, it's not the end of the world. But at the same time, there's also evidence to indicate that it really was a big deal for him. One further contextual thing I'll state, and then I'll touch on the next slide, is that if you look at the presidential history of the United States, there have been very few presidents who haven't been reelected for a second term. So that might also possibly have been something that Eisenhower and some of the officials in his administration were aware of. So important context there about the controversy about whether or not he did or he didn't care about the 1956 presidential election. And it's all very fascinating. Okay, so this brings me to my next slide. And I title this slide, "It's not 1938, it's 1956." So I think it's important now for me to touch on a few things. So I'll start off by reading what's stated here. Eisenhower demonstrated this understanding throughout the crisis with clarity. This understanding that I'm referring to, of course, is what Stephen Ambrose had talked about as this process of crisis leadership and waging peace, as Eisenhower called it, with remarkable clarity. He remained calm. He looked carefully at his options throughout the crisis. And once again, he stated in volume 2 of his memoirs about former British Prime Minister Anthony Eden that, and I quote, "He equated any exercise of Allied restraint and patience to the arguments which prevailed during the rise of Hitler during the years prior to 1939. Now, this is really significant because when it comes to events in history, we have to recognize that a lot of events like this, they're like a chess match. But with each chess match, the pieces are in a different spot on the board. Not every game is exactly the same. And of course, the ever so significant question of history repeating itself. It's something that's talked about a lot amongst historians. Does history repeat itself? Some historians say it does. Some historians say it doesn't. My answer is it depends on what you're talking about. Broadly speaking, I think that there certainly are patterns of repetition. And if you're speaking in broad terms, history does repeat itself. But when you're getting into details really do matter. And when you're trying to draw historic parallels, you want to be very careful, because in the context of Eden's mistake, he was looking at the chessboard of 1938 and not the chessboard of 1956. New realities had emerged. The nuclear threat, the threat of nuclear annihilation was now real. There were nuclear superpowers in both the United States and the Soviet Union. This was a new chess game. This was a new chess match, and this was a new chess board. So you got to be able to look at that stuff. And a good book that helps with that is this book, The Landscape of History: How Historians Map the Past, by John Lewis Gaddis. And his discussion of the historical method has one part where he actually talks about geometric fractals, which are like tiny little shape pieces, but they all get put together like pieces in a puzzle to form a pattern. And you have to examine lots and lots of different pieces, and you have to take your time to put the pieces together in detail to recognize and see a pattern and look at similarities and differences in relation to patterns from various events of history. And, when I look at the situation, President Eisenhower's crisis leadership skills, and C-SPAN actually gives presidential rankings. They rate Eisenhower as sixth out of 45 presidents for crisis leadership skills. He's considered to be one of the best presidents in U.S. history for sound crisis leadership skills. And a lot of that had to do with Suez in 1956, because he was looking carefully at the patterns. He was looking carefully at the chessboard and realizing that this isn't 1938, it's 1956. And we have a new situation that we're dealing with, and diplomacy can still work. Another quote I like to think of is force if necessary, but not necessarily force. And I think that Eisenhower recognized that, because, as I quoted earlier, he really did despise war as any lifelong career military veteran would. And he realized if there's any possibility of stopping armed conflict from occurring, you should. Because, as Karl von Clausewitz wrote in Principles on the Nature of Warfare, wars always escalate. And if there's anybody who knew that, it was Eisenhower. So he made a difficult decision, but he also knew he could diffuse the situation very quickly, and he did. So from that standpoint, Eisenhower employed great crisis leadership skills, as Stephen Ambrose points out in his autobiography, through a sensible, evidence-based, data-driven, calm, careful, option-focused process in order to work through the crisis. And then when he realized that he'd done the heavy lifting and he'd gotten through the majority of the crisis, then he did relax and focus on election night and victory, which he won in a landslide in the 1956 election. Okay, so other than that, I just wanted to show my references. And then after I show my references there, I think I got about 3 pages. So there's the Stephen Ambrose biography. I have references to images, Vucetic's book, The Anglosphere. Other than that, I'll take a look at the next slide. I've got a plethora of information. Most of my images came from Encyclopedia Britannica or the Eisenhower Presidential Museum and Library. I've also got some information from the Imperial War Museums and an image there. I've made a reference to JSTOR. I got the image of the French, the Israelis, and the British collaborating in Sèvres, France, from that JSTOR article. And then I think there's just one more page for references. So Churchill and the Presidents, Dwight Eisenhower, Sentiment and Politics, and then the United States presidential election of 1956. And that's where I got the image of Eisenhower celebrating victory on election night. I'm at the concluding component of my presentation now. Samantha, thank you so much for all your assistance. You made it so much easier for me. And Joy, thank you so much for your introduction and all of your hard work. It's greatly appreciated.
Joy, we don't have your sound.
Is that better?
Got you now. Yeah.
Okay, I apologize.
No
All
problem.
right. So again, thank you so much for that great presentation. We have a few minutes to take some questions from the chat, and I have a few questions of my own. So we'll see if we get to those.
Thank you.
All right. So the first question says Churchill was by then an elder statesman. What was his role and thoughts as the crisis unfolded?
So that's an interesting question. As the crisis unfolded, I think as soon as he realized that the U.S. wasn't going to give support, that he was just trying to diffuse the situation and move on as quickly as possible, which is one of the things that he stated in a letter that he traded with Eisenhower. He was very close with Eisenhower. But on top of that, in the lead up to the crisis, he had really promoted this idea that the new Munich of 1938 was on the Suez Canal. So Churchill was also pushing for aggressive military action in the lead up to the crisis. And it's interesting because from 1951 to 1955, Churchill got back in after losing the general election in 1945. And when Eden was his foreign secretary from 1951 to 1955, he was pushing for a military withdrawal of British soldiers in Egypt. So basically, the British came in and took over and colonized Egypt in 1878. And then in 1922, Egypt attained its independence. But the British military presence was sustained in the Suez Canal. And they basically signed the Anglo-Egyptian Treaty of 1936. And that was to withdraw the British military by 1956. But Churchill wasn't so sure about that. And he was pushing for more aggressive action. But then at the same time, I also read an interesting statement about his apprehension about what could happen when Eden became prime minister. He was worried that something was possibly going to go wrong for him, but it wasn't very specific. So I would say that Churchill's role was pushing the British government to engage in this activity. But then when he realized Eisenhower said no, and he realized how different the situation was for the United Kingdom, he immediately tried to make amends through personal diplomacy and personal diplomatic contact with Eisenhower. So I don't know if that helps answer the question.
Well, I'm not certain if it answers the question. If it doesn't, let us know. But it does lead to a question that I had, and that is, during this time, technically Egypt owned the canal, correct?
Yeah.
So then wasn't it well within their right to nationalize it?
Yes. Well, and that was actually something that, it's interesting because I bought this book when I was at the Eisenhower Presidential Museum and Library. And one of the things that David A. Nichols, the author of this book, Eisenhower in 56, talks about is that Eisenhower was watching it going, well, it's their country, it's their land, and it's their property. And since Nasser announced the nationalization on July 26th, the canal is still operating. So, for him, it was kind of we really need to go to all-out war here when the canal is still operating since it's been nationalized. And that's I hope a bit of an insight in relation to your question there, Joy. Does that make sense?
It did. It makes a lot of sense. All right, thank you. So we'll move on to, do you see any similarities between USMA graduate, war leader, and President Eisenhower in this crisis, and USMA graduate, war leader, and President Ulysses S. Grant, sorry, in the crisis in Cuba in 1873 to 1875.
So when it comes to Grant's presidency, I haven't looked very much into that the Cuba crisis. So I unfortunately don't know a lot, but from what I can say of Grant, General Grant, from what I do know, I think Grant had a similar mindset to Eisenhower, very much, a respected war hero, uh, and someone who had, good crisis leadership skills, and someone who recognized that, if you can avoid military conflict, you should. So from that standpoint, there's one broad parallel I know between Grant and Eisenhower, but I don't know enough details in relation to 1873 to 1875 to comment. My apologies for that. I'm sorry.
Well, no need to apologize. We understand we can't know everything. Richard asked, what is the book, Mike, behind you?
Oh, yes. Yeah. So let me show the books here. So, Mike is the memoirs of former Canadian Prime Minister Lester B. Pearson and Canada's only Nobel Peace Prize winner. And the reason why I put that up is because he wrote quite extensively about his role in the Suez Crisis in Volume 2 of the memoirs of Lester B. Pearson. So he wrote 3 volumes to his memoirs. He finished the first volume on his own and started the second, and had parts of the third volume he was working on before he tragically died. And then his son finished volumes 2 and 3. But in volume 2, he talks a lot about what happened. He makes some similar statements to Eisenhower and saying how surprised he was by British military action. And he also talks about the fact that him and John Foster Dulles had worked really close together at the United Nations for the resolution on a ceasefire. So yeah, I hope that that helps with Mike Volume 2. Thanks for the question.
All right. Frank would like to know, are you writing a book about this era in American history? And he also says, thank you for a great lecture.
Oh, thank you so much. And thank you for the question. I have a number of book ideas on my mind right now. I haven't thought a lot about writing a book on this era. I've thought about writing a number of books that relate to Canadian history. I would say the closest is I'm contemplating writing a book about the British and the Canadians working together to liberate the Nazi concentration camp Bergen-Belsen in 1945. And I want to write a book that focuses on the Canadian role. So that's the closest to that era in relation to book writing. But it's certainly something that I may end up writing a book on one day. So yeah, thank you for the compliment and thank you for the question.
Okay, well, good luck on your book. 2 more questions, and then I think we'll wrap it up.
Sure.
The first one was Nasser really all that interested in communism, or was this more so fear and propaganda, mostly because of the Cold War?
That's a great question, and the evidence indicates, based on everything that I've looked at so far, that Nasser was not all that interested in communism. What was going on in the context of the Middle East was a lot of conflict between Israel and its neighbors. At that point in time, there was heavy conflict between Israel and Egypt. There was a lot of cross-border skirmishes and fighting. So Nasser's focus was to try and win over allies in close proximity to Israel, and his focus was on military conflict with Israel. Egypt was actually part of the non-alignment movement, which is a movement from a number of countries. India, Yugoslavia were probably the 2 most well-known countries in the non-alignment movement, and Egypt was part of that. But there was always that possibility that a country could change its tune, and as a result of that, within the context of the Cold War, America and the United Kingdom were trying to win over Egypt. Also, the Soviet Union was trying to win over Egypt. In 1950, there was actually a tripartite declaration signed between France, the United Kingdom, and the United States. And what they committed to was creating a balance of power in relation to arms. And one of the things that happened during the Suez Crisis, and this is another thing that Eisenhower said, was we have to maintain our commitment to the tripartite declaration, which was giving balance for arms to all countries in the Middle East, right? So it was kind of that peace by superior firepower doctrine. If all the countries have superior firepower, they're less likely to go to war with each other. But on top of that, the tripartite declaration stated that if any country invaded another country, then the United States, France, and the United Kingdom had to come to the aid of the country being invaded and repeal the aggressor. So that also complicated things. And the United Kingdom, in personal diplomatic contact, told the American government that the tripartite declaration was ancient history, but Eisenhower didn't feel that way. So apologies for a lengthy response, but I hope that answers your question.
No, that was a great response. That was something I was actually interested in, because I know that was part of that difficult decision of having the idea that you might have to go to war with, this important ally because of the treaty. Our final question is what we didn't tell the people is that you've done your research here. And so we always like it when one of our researchers comes back and does a presentation on his research that he's conducted here. And so we just want to know, what collections did you use, or what specifically did you learn? Can you speak to the importance of researching using primary source materials?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. Looking in great detail at the primary source materials kind of relates to that analogy from that book I mentioned earlier, The Landscape of History. You put together the pieces in a puzzle, and then you formulate a pattern. And you really have to look very carefully at the primary documents in order to ensure you're getting things right in your analysis. I looked in quite a bit of detail at the personal papers of John Foster Dulles. And what was fascinating was there was a lot of personal diplomatic activity leading up to the Suez Crisis that occurred between the British and the American government. They met on multiple occasions prior to 1956 and issued joint statements of, what commitments they shared together. Another thing that I want to mention just in the context of Suez was this was also a major watershed moment for the British, because during World War II, they were part of the Grand Alliance. And prior to World War II, they were the big British Empire. And this was very much a moment of humility and a sobering moment for the British. But you start to realize that when you look carefully at the primary documents. So when I look at John Foster Dulles's personal papers, you could see that, personal diplomatic correspondence with the British was a big and immensely significant foreign policy commitment of the American government. And I think that the British government still thought of themselves as this big, powerful empire as a result of that. And this, the Suez Crisis and its aftermath became a big watershed moment for the British, because they realized they weren't the big, powerful British Empire anymore, and they couldn't engage in a major military activity without U.S. consultation and support. But they also realized that the support for decolonization was growing, because when Eisenhower said no to the British government, there were a lot of poorer and economically disadvantaged and either still colonized or just recently decolonized countries that suddenly said, wow, like the United States of America just said no on the world stage to the United Kingdom. And that helped the United States gain a lot of respect, and it gave some momentum to decolonization. But all of that is something that comes together when you're looking carefully at the primary documents. On top of that, I also looked at Ann Whitman, who was Eisenhower's personal secretary. I looked at a lot of her personal papers. And once again, I saw a lot of those habits of cooperation, but patterns of personal diplomatic communication and correspondence prior to, during, and after the Suez Crisis. So I hope that answers your question. Thank you.
It does. And thanks for mentioning Ann Whitman, because we love her here. So thank you so much for your presentation and for answering our questions. We certainly appreciate it. And thank you to our audience for tuning in and for your questions. And we just have a few housekeeping things and we will wrap it up. Our 2023 public programs were made possible courtesy of the Eisenhower Foundation and the Jeff Cope Memorial Foundation. We want to express our appreciation for them, because without their generous contributions, we would not be able to bring these programs to you. Our next program is our Lunch and Learn. That is on Thursday, April 27th, here at the Eisenhower Presidential Library. At noon. And of course, we will also have a virtual component. We will welcome Dr. Edward Kiefer, and he will talk about Eisenhower and the Korean War armistice. So thank you so much. Thank you again for joining us, and have a great evening.
Thank you, and take care. All the best, everyone.